December 1944 dawned over the Dents. December 16, 1944, the quiet Ardennes forest was about to witness the deadliest surprise attack of World War II. In the freezing cold and thick fog, thousands of soldiers faced a moment that would change everything. What happened next shattered plans, broke men, and altered the course of history forever. This is the story no one expected. Ardennes forest with an uneasy calm. The chill of early winter clung to the landscape, the air crisp and still beneath a pale, washed-out sky. Patches of snow dusted the rolling hills, covering the thick blanket of firs and hardwoods that stretched endlessly across Belgium and Luxembourg. It was a quiet, deceptive morning, one that masked the storm gathering beneath the surface. Allied forces, stretched thin after months of relentless advance, held a fragile line in this remote sector. To most, the Ardennes seemed a quiet backwater, a place where the war's fury had softened and soldiers could catch their breath before the next push into Germany. But the truth was far grimmer. High Command knew this sector was vulnerable. The dense forest, the winding roads, and the winter weather presented challenges that slowed supply lines and complicated maneuver warfare. Yet even these dangers seemed minor compared to what awaited. For Adolf Hitler, late 1944 was a moment of desperate calculation. The Third Reich was faltering on multiple fronts. The Soviet forces were pressing hard in the east, grinding inexorably toward Berlin. The Western Allies had liberated Paris and were preparing to cross into the German heartland. In this context, Hitler conceived a bold, last-ditch offensive, one that would split the American and British armies, seize the vital port of Antwerp, and turn the tide of war back in Germany's favor. This plan, known to history as the Ardennes Offensive, or more famously the Battle of the Bulge, would become the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. On the ground, the men stationed in the Ardennes were far from prepared for what was to come. Many were replacements, fresh from training camps in the United States, inexperienced and unsure. The harsh winter weather compounded their unease. Freezing temperatures bit through their wool uniforms, and the constant threat of icy roads and deep snow weighed on morale. Supply shortages were common, with units often low on winter clothing and adequate food. Despite the difficulty, a quiet sense of resolve endured among these soldiers. They were part of a larger war effort, and many clung to the hope that the end was near. Among the units in place were elements of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies, thinly spread to cover a wide front. Officers worked tirelessly to bolster defenses, erecting makeshift fortifications and scouting the surrounding forest. The dense woods offered both shelter and danger, an environment ripe for ambushes and surprise attacks. The American soldiers became intimately familiar with the terrain, learning to navigate the tangled undergrowth and narrow roads, all the while aware that the enemy might strike at any moment. One such group was the 99th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Checkerboard Division, for their distinctive shoulder patch. Positioned in some of the most exposed areas of the Ardennes, they were tasked with holding key junctions and roads that were vital for maintaining supply lines and communication. Among their ranks were men from diverse backgrounds, farmers, factory workers, and small-town boys thrown together in the crucible of war. Their training had been rigorous but brief, and many lacked combat experience. Yet, in this quiet before the storm, they found moments of camaraderie, sharing stories by the campfires, tending to their rifles, and steeling themselves for the uncertainty ahead. The German forces preparing to launch the offensive were equally determined, driven by a mixture of fanatic loyalty, fear, and desperation. The Wehrmacht's plan called for over 200,000 troops and nearly 1,000 tanks to spearhead the attack. Commanders meticulously rehearsed the assault in secret, moving troops and armor under the cover of night and dense fog to avoid detection by Allied reconnaissance. The element of surprise was crucial. The Germans knew that their only hope to disrupt the Allies lay in striking before reinforcements could arrive. Among the German units was the elite 1st SS Panzer Division, veterans hardened by years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. They were joined by freshly equipped but less experienced troops, rushed into battle as the Reich's resources dwindled. The terrain favored the defenders, but the attackers exploited the region's narrow roads and wooded hills to mask their movements. Snowstorms and freezing rain limited air support for both sides, forcing the battle to unfold largely as a ground war fought with artillery barrages, infantry assaults, and armored clashes. Back with the Americans, the tension was palpable. Reports of unusual troop movements and intercepted radio messages hinted that something was amiss, but no one could predict the scale or timing of the impending strike. Soldiers kept watch through the long nights, eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of enemy patrols. The cold seeped into their bones, and the forest seemed to close in around them, amplifying the sense of isolation and vulnerability. Lieutenants and sergeants did their best to maintain discipline and morale, emphasizing the importance of readiness. But beneath the surface, fear and uncertainty lingered. Letters from home and brief moments of respite were small comforts against the growing storm. Some men prayed quietly, others steeled themselves with quiet determination, resolved to face whatever lay ahead. As December 16th approached, the final pieces fell into place. The German forces massed, their tanks hidden behind ridges, their infantry poised to strike. Early that morning, under the cover of darkness and heavy fog, the largest surprise attack on American forces in World War II was unleashed. The thunder of artillery shook the Ardennes, echoing through the trees like a violent storm. Soldiers who had moments before been settling into their posts now found themselves plunged into a chaotic nightmare of fire and fury. The initial German assault quickly shattered the thin American defenses, overwhelming outposts and forcing units into hasty retreats. Communications broke down amid the confusion, and commanders struggled to coordinate an effective response. The snow-covered roads became clogged with fleeing vehicles and troops, slowing any chance of organized resistance. Despite the shock and initial losses, many American soldiers fought back fiercely, buying precious time for reinforcements to mobilize. The Ardennes, once a quiet forested backwater, had become a crucible of war where strategy met human endurance in its rawest form. As the sun rose on that cold December morning, it was clear that the battle to come would test the limits of courage, resilience, and sacrifice. The moment everything changed forever had arrived. December 16, 1944, arrived cloaked in an oppressive gray fog that blanketed the Ardennes forest, a heavy veil that seemed to mute even the faintest sound of the wilderness. Snow lay thick upon the ground, muffling footsteps and camouflaging the shifting shadows of armored columns and marching infantry. The cold was relentless, seeping through layers of woolen leather, numbing fingers and stiffening muscles. For the American soldiers spread thin along the front, it was just another harsh winter day in a war that had already demanded so much. Yet none could have fully prepared for the storm about to break. Before dawn, under the cloak of near-total darkness and near-zero visibility, the German army launched its carefully orchestrated offensive, a lightning strike aimed at piercing the Allied lines, seizing vital crossroads, and shattering the fragile cohesion of the American forces. The first sound was a distant rumble, growing rapidly into a thunderous roar as artillery batteries opened fire with devastating precision. Explosions tore through the forest, shaking the ground beneath the soldiers' feet, splintering trees, and sending geysers of earth and snow into the air. The sudden violence shattered the morning stillness, replacing it with chaos and confusion. American outposts in the front lines bore the brunt of the initial assault. Many were hastily constructed positions, manned by weary troops, often replacements who had only recently arrived from training camps and were unfamiliar with the unforgiving terrain. Communication lines, vulnerable and overstretched, were severed almost immediately. Radios sputtered and died under the relentless barrage, cutting off commands from battalion and division headquarters. Officers struggled to issue orders, relying on runners who braved deadly fire to carry messages from unit to unit. But the fog and smoke made navigation perilous, and many couriers were lost or delayed. Amid this breakdown, small groups of soldiers found themselves isolated, cut off from reinforcements or resupply, forced to rely on their own initiative, in a nightmare landscape of violence. German armored divisions spearheaded the assault, rolling forward in waves of steel and fire. The dense forest, while difficult to navigate, offered concealment from Allied reconnaissance planes grounded by the inclement weather. Tiger and Panther tanks emerged suddenly from the fog, their massive tracks crushing snow and foliage beneath. They shattered American defensive positions with direct fire and sheer force, their engines growling like beasts unleashed. Infantry followed closely behind, moving with grim determination through the icy underbrush, clearing resistance with brutal efficiency. The surprise and speed of the German advance overwhelmed many units before they could mount an effective defense. The Americans fought back wherever they could, though often in desperate and disorganized bursts. Machine guns and rifles cracked through the fog, but the weight of the enemy attack was overwhelming. The cold sharpened every sound, the whistle of incoming shells, the crack of rifle fire, the anguished cries of wounded men, each piercing the still air with brutal clarity. Soldiers grappled with not just the enemy, but the environment itself. Fingers stiffened by cold failed to load weapons quickly, boots slipped in ice-covered mud, and exhaustion gnawed at resolve. Those caught in the open sought shelter behind trees or in shallow foxholes hastily scraped from frozen earth, but such cover was meager against the onslaught. Amid the retreat, some American units managed to mount stubborn defenses, buying critical time. These pockets of resistance, often led by junior officers or non-commissioned officers acting on their own initiative, slowed the German advance along key roads and intersections. Such resistance was marked by fierce close-quarters fighting, where the dense forest turned every encounter into a brutal melee. Men fought with rifles, pistols, and bayonets, locked in a deadly struggle amid the cold and chaos. The landscape itself became a trap. Trees, fallen logs, and snowdrifts could provide cover but also hindered rapid movement and the use of heavier weapons. The psychological toll on the soldiers was immense. The shock of being suddenly overwhelmed, the confusion of fractured command, and the relentless pressure of enemy fire combined to erode morale. Many faced the raw terror of uncertainty. Were they about to be surrounded? Could they hold the line? How long would reinforcements take to arrive? Some soldiers struggled to suppress panic, clinging instead to memories of home or the quiet hope that this storm would soon pass. Others steeled themselves with grim determination, resolved to buy whatever time they could for their comrades. In the midst of this turmoil, acts of quiet heroism emerged, medics tending the wounded under fire, men shielding their friends, small squads organizing last-ditch defenses. The chaos extended beyond the front lines. Rear echelon units scrambled to organize support, repair damaged roads, and establish supply routes under threat of air and artillery attack. Commanders at division and corps level grappled with incomplete and conflicting reports, attempting to piece together a coherent picture of the unfolding disaster. Decisions had to be made rapidly: where to send reinforcements, which units to pull back, which positions to hold at all costs. Communication remained a critical challenge. Radio silence or static often masked cries for help. Yet despite the fog of war, pockets of effective leadership emerged, coordinating countermeasures that would soon prove vital. As the day wore on, the German advance carved a deep wedge into the Allied lines, creating the infamous Bulge that would lend the battle its name. The terrain funneled movement into narrow, snow-covered roads, complicating logistics and making it difficult for the Americans to maneuver reserves quickly. Vehicles became stuck or bogged down, while the cold and exhaustion sapped the fighting strength of soldiers already stretched to their limits. The dense forests made aerial reconnaissance nearly impossible, leading commanders to rely on ground reports that were often fragmented and delayed. The confusion bred miscommunication, and friendly units sometimes lost track of one another amid the shattered landscape. Yet amid the grim statistics and tactical setbacks, the human dimension remained at the forefront. Letters clutched in pockets, dog tags glinting beneath frosted uniforms, whispered prayers in the stillness between bursts of gunfire, all spoke to the soldiers' vulnerability and resilience. Men fought not just for territory or orders, but for survival and for each other. The bitter cold, the pervasive fear, and the overwhelming odds forged bonds of trust and sacrifice that would endure beyond the battle. By nightfall, the scale of the German surprise had become clear. Entire battalions had been overrun or forced into retreat. Communications with several forward units were lost. Yet resistance continued in pockets, and American commanders began to rally available forces to stabilize critical points. Reinforcements from neighboring sectors were rushed forward, even as the threat of further German breakthroughs loomed. The weather, which had initially aided the Germans by grounding Allied air power, remained a double-edged sword, imposing severe hardship on all combatants. In the quiet moments between shelling, the forest bore silent witness to the unfolding catastrophe: snow stained with blood, shattered trees twisted by explosions, and the distant echoes of gunfire fading into the darkening sky. The soldiers, worn and battered, prepared for what would come next. They knew the fight was far from over. The first day of the Ardennes offensive had laid bare the vulnerabilities of the Allied front, but also the tenacity of those determined to hold it. The bitter lessons learned in these frozen woods would shape the battle's course in the weeks ahead, as men on both sides grappled with the harsh realities of war amidst the unforgiving winter landscape. The battle intensified with a ruthless momentum that seemed to surge and swell like the winter storm gripping the Ardennes. By mid-December, the German offensive had carved a deep and jagged wedge into the Allied front, and the fragile lines stretched thin in every direction. The forests and ridges, already cloaked in ice and snow, became the grim theaters of relentless combat. Key positions, particularly Bastogne and Elsenborn Ridge, emerged as focal points where the battle's ferocity concentrated into brutal struggle. Soldiers found themselves entrenched in a war that tested not just their physical endurance but the very limits of their will to survive. Bastogne, a small Belgian town surrounded by thick woods and crisscrossed with narrow roads, gained sudden and critical importance. Its network of 7 vital highways made it a strategic linchpin. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the arteries of movement through the Ardennes. When German forces encircled the town on December 21, they aimed to suffocate the American defenders and clear a path deeper into Belgium. The defenders, however, were resolute. Elements of the 101st Airborne Division, hastily deployed and exhausted from continuous fighting, found themselves trapped but unyielding. Their commanding officer, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, became a symbol of defiance when he famously replied, "Nuts!" to a German demand for surrender, a word that encapsulated the stubborn grit that would come to define the siege. Inside Bastogne, the bitter cold bit deep, seeping through layered uniforms and gnawing at frost-chapped skin. Snow lay thick on the ground and ice glazed the streets and rooftops. The weather was a cruel adversary in itself, limiting aerial support and making resupply nearly impossible. American soldiers huddled in hastily dug foxholes, abandoned buildings, and cramped cellars, their breath rising in clouds as they prepared for constant bombardment. German artillery and mortar shells rained down ceaselessly, turning the town into a shattered landscape of rubble and frozen earth. Explosions threw snow and debris into the frigid air, and the wails of wounded men echoed beneath the relentless roar of battle. Despite the siege conditions, the morale among the defenders remained remarkably strong. The men endured hunger, cold, and exhaustion, often going days without proper meals or fresh ammunition. Supplies were desperately low, and each delivery carried immense risk, with pilots navigating treacherous weather to drop parachutes filled with food, medical kits, and ammunition. The soldiers' endurance was as much psychological as physical, knowing that relief might come, but never certain when. Yet the determination to hold Bastogne, to deny the enemy this vital crossroads, galvanized every man. Letters home, shared memories, quiet prayers, and whispered conversations underscored a shared commitment that transcended fear. To the north, the fight at Elsenborn Ridge was equally pivotal. This high ground formed a natural barrier, a rugged ridge line that offered commanding views of the surrounding forests and roads. German forces aimed to seize it to protect their flank and secure supply routes. The ridge was defended primarily by the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, whose soldiers faced some of the fiercest combat of the entire offensive. The terrain favored the defenders, with dense woods, rocky outcrops, and frozen ground offering both cover and obstacles. American troops dug in deep, using the landscape to their advantage while enduring continuous artillery bombardment and infantry assaults. The fighting at Elsenborn was characterized by repeated waves of German attacks, often supported by tanks and heavy artillery. The snow muffled movements, making sudden assaults more difficult to detect but also slowing advances. Defenders used machine guns and mortars to disrupt German formations, while engineers worked under fire to clear obstacles and repair damaged defenses. The cold added a merciless layer of difficulty. Rifles jammed, feet went numb, and men suffered from frostbite as the days stretched on. Casualty rates climbed, and medical personnel struggled to treat the wounded amid the relentless conditions. Yet the ridge held firm, becoming a symbol of steadfast resistance that blunted the German offensive's northern push. Supply lines, stretched thin across icy roads and under constant threat from enemy patrols, struggled to keep pace with the intensity of the battle. Fuel, food, ammunition, and medical supplies were in short supply, forcing commanders to prioritize distribution carefully. Reinforcements arrived sporadically, often delayed by treacherous weather or blocked roads. The reliance on airdrops became critical, but poor visibility and fierce enemy anti-aircraft fire complicated these efforts. Logistical challenges compounded the physical and psychological strain on troops, many of whom faced weeks of relentless combat with little relief. Commanders on both sides grappled with the unfolding crisis. For the Germans, the initial momentum of the offensive was slowing as American resistance hardened and resources became scarce. The harsh winter, which had aided their surprise attack, now impeded movement and resupply. Strategic decisions grew more fraught, balancing the desire for swift victory against mounting losses. On the Allied side, leadership focused on consolidating defensive positions, shoring up weak points, and preparing for counteroffensives. Coordination among infantry armor and artillery units became crucial as they adapted to the shifting dynamics of battle. Amid the operational complexity, the human dimension remained starkly present. Soldiers endured days and nights of near-constant alertness, sleep stolen in short bursts amid shell fire and patrols. The relentless cold sapped strength and morale, while the constant threat of death or capture weighed heavily on minds. Letters home, where they existed, were a lifeline, connecting men to a world beyond the frozen forest. Quiet acts of kindness, sharing rations, tending to the wounded, or simply offering a reassuring word, became vital anchors amid chaos. The collective will to endure, to hold fast in the face of overwhelming odds, became a defining thread weaving through every unit. As the days passed, the battle at Bastogne and Elsenborn Ridge crystallized into a brutal test of endurance, strategy, and human spirit. These engagements, fought in one of the harshest winters of the war, underscored the complexity of modern warfare, where weather, terrain, logistics, and morale intertwined with tactics and firepower. The resilience of the American defenders, despite encirclement and shortages, thwarted German plans to swiftly break through the Ardennes. Their stand would not only shape the course of the battle but also serve as a testament to the indomitable courage and sacrifice of those caught in the crucible of war. By late December, the harsh winter of the Ardennes had settled into a relentless, icy grip, and the battle that had erupted suddenly on December 16 showed no sign of abating. The initial shock of the German offensive had fractured the Allied front, carving deep bulges into the lines and sending ripples of confusion and retreat through American units unprepared for such ferocity. Yet, as the days wore on, a critical shift began to emerge, one shaped by the arrival of fresh forces and the iron resolve of commanders determined to turn the tide. Among these reinforcements, General George S. Patton's Third Army stood poised to make its decisive move, a force famed for its mobility, discipline, and aggressive spirit. The arrival of Patton's troops marked more than a mere numerical boost. It was a signal that the Allied response was coalescing into a coordinated effort to blunt, then reverse, the German advance. The terrain, battered by weeks of fighting and relentless winter weather, was unforgiving. Snow blanketed the rolling hills and dense forests, masking craters left by artillery and concealing treacherous patches of ice beneath its white veneer. The cold seeped into bones and weapons alike, with rifles and machine guns freezing in soldiers' hands, while men battled frostbite and exhaustion alongside the enemy. Roads were clogged with tanks, trucks, and convoys, many stalled or broken down under the strain of icy conditions. Communication remained fraught, radio static and cut lines hampered coordination, demanding that officers adapt swiftly, often relying on couriers and messengers who braved open fire and freezing wind to carry vital orders. Amid this grueling environment, Bastogne, encircled and besieged since December 21, stood as a stubborn symbol of resistance. The 101st Airborne Division and attached units, cut off from the main forces, endured relentless German bombardment and repeated infantry assaults. Supplies were perilously low, and the men huddled in foxholes, cellars, and shattered buildings, enduring freezing temperatures with dwindling rations and ammunition. Yet the defenders' spirit remained unbroken. The famous reply of General McAuliffe, "Nuts!" had become a rallying cry, emblematic of the refusal to surrender despite overwhelming odds. The town's defenders fought not just to hold ground but to deny the Germans a critical crossroads essential to their offensive success. As Patton's Third Army mobilized, its commanders faced daunting challenges. Swift movement through snow-choked forests and narrow roads required meticulous planning and precise timing. Tanks, artillery, and infantry had to advance in coordination despite limited visibility and the constant threat of ambush. Intelligence efforts intensified, using all available reconnaissance to track German positions and gauge their strength. The operation was as much a test of logistics as tactics. Fuel, ammunition, and food had to be delivered over fragile supply lines vulnerable to attack and weather. Morale, always fragile in such harsh conditions, was bolstered by the knowledge that relief was on its way, fueling a renewed determination among beleaguered troops. December 26 marked a significant milestone as Patton's forces reached the outskirts of Bastogne, initiating the long-awaited relief of the encircled defenders. The arrival of fresh troops brought a tangible shift in momentum. Coordinated attacks disrupted German siege lines, opening corridors for resupply and medical evacuation. Soldiers who had endured days of siege, cold, and isolation finally glimpsed hope. The lifting of the encirclement was not an immediate victory. Fierce fighting continued within and around the town, but the psychological impact was profound. The relief signaled that the Allies would not yield the Ardennes to the German gamble, and it underscored the resilience forged in the freezing woods. The interplay between high command decisions and frontline valor was crucial in this phase. Commanders balanced aggressive maneuvers with caution, aware that rash actions could result in costly losses amid the already devastated terrain. On the front lines, soldiers adapted to a grueling rhythm of attack and defense, often fighting in near darkness and bitter cold. Infantrymen engaged in close combat, supported by tanks maneuvering through narrow streets and forests. Artillery barrages hammered German positions, while engineers worked tirelessly to clear obstacles and repair roads. Every advance was hard-won, a testament to disciplined coordination and individual acts of courage. Elsewhere along the Bulge, the tide began to turn similarly. Allied units reinforced vulnerable sectors, gradually sealing breaches and restoring cohesive defensive lines. The German offensive, initially marked by rapid advances and surprise, slowed under mounting resistance and logistical strain. Fuel shortages crippled armored units, and exhaustion eroded fighting capacity. Meanwhile, Allied air forces, aided by improving weather conditions, resumed sorties that targeted supply lines and enemy concentrations, further blunting the attack. The emotional tone among soldiers and commanders deepened with this shift. Hope, long suppressed beneath layers of fatigue and fear, rekindled slowly but surely. The grim determination that had carried men through the darkest hours began to merge with cautious optimism. Letters home, rare but cherished, reflected this fragile balance, a yearning for peace tempered by the stark realities of ongoing combat. Amid shattered towns, snow-covered forests, and muddy roads, small moments of humanity persisted: a shared cigarette, a whispered prayer, a brief lull in fighting to tend to the wounded. Strategically, the relief of Bastogne and the steady counterattacks marked a profound turning point. The German plan, predicated on swift, decisive breakthroughs, was unraveling under the combined weight of Allied resilience and resourcefulness. The momentum that had carried the Wehrmacht deep into the Ardennes now faltered. What remained was a grueling war of attrition fought in the worst conditions imaginable, where every yard gained or lost demanded extraordinary effort and sacrifice. This shift would have lasting implications, not just for the battle itself but for the broader war. The failure of the Ardennes offensive depleted German forces, exhausted their commanders, and accelerated the collapse of the Third Reich's western defenses. For the Allies, it was a hard-won affirmation of strength and unity in the face of unexpected adversity. The courage of the soldiers, the skill of their leaders, and the sheer endurance of men caught in the bitter winter storm coalesced into a moment that altered the trajectory of the conflict. As the battle line slowly moved, the forests and towns bore silent witness to the unfolding drama, scarred by shellfire, littered with the detritus of war, and echoed by the unspoken stories of sacrifice. Soldiers pressed on through snow and mud, their faces etched with exhaustion and resolve. The winter of 1944 was proving not just a test of arms, but a crucible of spirit. This chapter, marked by the relentless advance of reinforcements and the hard-fought relief of Bastogne, captures the grim determination that defined this pivotal moment, a quiet yet profound shift where hope flickered amid devastation and the course of history quietly, irrevocably changed. By late January 1945, the battered forests and shattered towns of the Ardennes stood silent beneath a pale winter sky, bearing the scars of a battle that had tested the limits of endurance, strategy, and human will. The German offensive, once a thunderous surge of armored might and surprise attacks, had been decisively halted, then pushed back across the frozen landscape. The once quiet and remote region was now a graveyard of twisted metal, shattered trees, and deep trenches etched into the snow. The cost was staggering. Thousands of soldiers lay dead or wounded, both Allied and Axis forces depleted in a bitter contest that had drained reserves and shattered morale. The battle was over, but its echoes reverberated far beyond the frozen Ardennes, marking a turning point in the wider war for Europe. The physical devastation was immediate and unmistakable. Forests, once dense and green, had been stripped bare in places by relentless artillery bombardments and tank maneuvers. Trees stood as broken sentinels, their limbs splintered by explosions or scorched by fire. Roads were churned into mud or blocked by wrecked vehicles, tanks overturned in desperate last stands, trucks abandoned in hurried retreats, and supply convoys shredded by shellfire. Villages like Bastogne bore deep wounds, homes reduced to rubble, churches scarred by shrapnel, streets littered with debris and frozen blood. The cold, so merciless throughout the battle, now seemed a harsh caretaker of the dead and dying, preserving the grim tableau beneath layers of ice and snow. For the survivors, the end of the battle brought no immediate relief. The physical and psychological toll was profound. Many soldiers struggled with frostbite and exhaustion, their bodies ravaged by weeks of continuous combat and exposure to freezing temperatures. Medical units, overwhelmed and stretched thin, worked tirelessly to treat the wounded amid challenging conditions, often improvising with limited supplies. The constant trauma, the sounds of shelling, the loss of comrades, the relentless uncertainty, left deep emotional scars. Letters home spoke of numbness, sorrow, and a longing for the war to end, while the quiet moments between orders were filled with reflection and the heavy weight of survival guilt. The tactical and strategic consequences of the Battle of the Bulge were significant. The German gamble to split the Allied lines and seize the port of Antwerp had failed, their forces too exhausted and depleted to maintain momentum. The offensive's failure hastened the collapse of Nazi Germany's Western Front, as depleted German units retreated in disarray, unable to regroup effectively. The Allies, though battered, emerged with reinforced confidence and unity. The battle had demonstrated their capacity to absorb shock, adapt quickly, and mount coordinated counterattacks even under dire circumstances. It also exposed vulnerabilities in Allied intelligence and preparedness, lessons that would inform subsequent operations. Amid the broader sweep of the war, the Ardennes clash was a brutal reminder of the unpredictability and cost of conflict. The timing, late in 1944, as the Allies pressed toward Germany's heartland, made the battle a pivotal moment. It was not just a contest of tanks and infantry, but a struggle for momentum, morale, and the varying narrative of victory. The endurance shown by American soldiers, many inexperienced and facing overwhelming odds, underscored the human dimension of war's vast machinery. Their sacrifice slowed the German war effort at a critical juncture and preserved the cohesion of Allied forces poised to advance into Germany in the coming months. For commanders on both sides, the battle was a harsh lesson in the limits of ambition and the brutal calculus of attrition. German leaders had risked their remaining strength on a high-stakes offensive that promised strategic gains but demanded an extraordinary toll. Allied commanders had confronted the chaos of surprise and the fragility of stretched lines but found resilience in coordination and determination. The winter's fury compounded every decision, turning even routine movements into life-or-death challenges. The battle became a crucible where leadership was tested as fiercely as the soldiers on the ground. Beyond strategy and tactics, the Battle of the Bulge also reshaped the landscape of memory and commemoration. Monuments and cemeteries would later rise in the Ardennes to honor those who fell, marking the ground where courage met catastrophe. Stories of heroism, whether the steadfast defense of Bastogne, the desperate actions of scattered units, or the relentless push of reinforcements, became woven into the fabric of American and Allied wartime identity. Yet, the battle also served as a sober reminder of war's randomness and the immense human cost behind every map and statistic. In the quiet aftermath, the soldiers who survived grappled with the meaning of what they had endured. The freezing cold and endless shellfire had stripped away illusions, revealing the raw core of human endurance. Bonds forged in foxholes and trenches transcended the battle, lasting long after the guns fell silent. Many carried invisible wounds, memories of friends lost, moments of terror, and the profound exhaustion of relentless combat. The return to normalcy was slow, the echoes of war lingering in hearts and minds. As the winter thawed and the Allies prepared to cross into Germany, the Ardennes battle stood as a defining chapter of World War II. It was a confrontation where surprise gave way to stubborn resistance, where strategy collided with weather and terrain, and where ordinary men faced extraordinary tests. The battle did not simply change the front lines, it changed the fate of 1944, accelerating the collapse of Nazi Germany's last hopes and setting the stage for the final push to victory in Europe. This closing chapter of the Ardennes story invites reflection on resilience amid devastation, the sacrifices that shaped history, and the enduring price of war. It is a testament to those who fought through bitter cold and chaos, whose courage carved a path through one of the war's deadliest and most dramatic episodes. In the frozen silence of the Ardennes woods, the legacy of their struggle remains etched, an unyielding reminder of the human spirit's capacity to endure and the profound costs exacted in the battle for freedom. If you want to uncover the untold stories and raw truths of World War II, where every battle changed the course of history, subscribe to WWII Impact now. Join us as we dive deep into the moments that shaped the war, revealing the courage, sacrifice, and impact that still echo today. Don't miss a single story. Hit that subscribe button and be part of the legacy.